John Carmichael had never considered himself a lucky man. Life in the small town of Willow Creek, Texas, was quiet, sometimes too quiet, and filled with its fair share of struggles. He ran a modest general store that sold everything from sacks of flour to nails, and from candles to boots. Business was steady, but never booming. Most days, he closed the shop just enough to cover his expenses and leave a little for his small family, a wife, Margaret, who spent her time managing the household, and their young son, Peter, who was full of curiosity and boundless energy. Despite working from sunrise to sunset, John often worried about money. Unexpected expenses had a way of creeping up when the roof leaked, when Peter caught a fever, or when the local sheriff needed a favor that required some cash. John's dreams of wealth were simple, almost naive. A few extra dollars that could allow him to fix the house properly, invest in the shop, and maybe give Peter the education he deserved. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, staring at a worn notebook, calculating costs, and planning for a better life. Each calculation reminded him how tight their life was. It was on one of these quiet evenings that John first heard about the lottery. The whole town seemed to be buzzing about it. A wealthy businessman had organized a local lottery with prizes that ranged from a small amount of cash to extravagant items, like a horse-drawn carriage or even a fine set of furniture. The final prize, whispered among the townsfolk with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, was said to be a fortune beyond imagining. John laughed at the idea at first. Lotteries were for dreamers, he told himself, and he was a man of facts and ledgers. But still, the idea lodged in his mind like a persistent itch. Margaret, ever the optimist, encouraged him. "Why not buy a ticket, John? Just one. What if you actually win?" Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and mischief. John hesitated. He had never bought a lottery ticket in his life. Money was too scarce for frivolity, and he did not want to gamble the little he had. Yet, deep down, there was a part of him, a tiny, foolish part, that wanted to see if fortune might smile on him for once. After a week of thinking, he decided to take the leap. The lottery ticket cost just $1. A small price for a dream, he thought. He bought the ticket from Mr. Lewis, the grinning man who ran the general store across town, and tucked it into his pocket. The next few weeks were filled with anxious waiting. John would sometimes pull the ticket from his pocket, staring at the numbers as if he could somehow coax the winning combination to appear. He tried to keep his mind on daily routines, managing the shop, keeping track of deliveries, and making sure Peter didn't get into trouble, but the ticket was always there, a quiet reminder of possibility. In the evenings, he would talk to Margaret about what he might do if he won. They dreamed together in hushed tones, imagining the new roof, the extra rooms, perhaps even a trip to New Orleans. For the first time in a long while, life felt lighter, filled with imagination and hope. Then came the day of the draw. The whole town gathered in the town hall, which had been decorated with banners and ribbons. John felt a strange mixture of excitement and disbelief as he stood among neighbors and friends, all eager to hear the results. The lottery official, a tall man with a booming voice and a neatly trimmed mustache, began calling out the winning numbers. The room held its breath as the numbers were announced. One by one, when the last number was read, John realized with a shock that every number on his ticket matched. He had won. For a moment, John could barely breathe. The world seemed to tilt slightly, the ordinary hall of wooden benches and faded banners suddenly shimmering with possibility. People began to clap, some cheering loudly, others whispering in astonishment. John's hands trembled as he handed over the ticket to the official, who verified it carefully. It was true, John Carmichael had won the grand prize. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could finally achieve. Margaret would be overjoyed, and Peter would be thrilled with toys, books, and a room of his own. He imagined paying off every debt, buying better stock for the shop, and even setting aside savings for emergencies. Finally, he thought, they could live without the constant pressure of financial worry. He felt an unfamiliar warmth of triumph and relief. But then came the twist that John had never imagined. The lottery official cleared his throat and announced the prize in a way that seemed almost casual. "Your prize, Mr. Carmichael, is ready," he said. A covered cart was brought forward, and the crowd leaned in with curiosity. With a dramatic flourish, the covering was lifted. Standing there was not a pile of coins, nor a chest of gold, nor a fine piece of furniture. It was a young woman. A Native American woman with striking features and an expression that spoke of both fear and dignity. The official continued, "She is your prize, given according to the lottery terms. She will serve as part of your household." John felt the world tilt again, but this time it was confusion and shock that gripped him. He had expected money. He had imagined material comfort. But not this. He could see the crowd whispering behind him, some nodding as if this were ordinary, others staring with curiosity and unease. The woman, who the officials said was called Nayeli, stood quietly, her eyes wide as she took in the room. She said nothing, but her gaze was calm and measured, as if she were evaluating everyone around her. John's first instinct was disbelief. "This must be some mistake," he stammered, glancing at the official. I expected money." The official shook his head politely. "The lottery terms were clear. You are to receive her as your prize. She comes from a family captured in recent conflicts and is now legally part of your household." The word household felt strange and heavy in John's ears. He had never considered owning another person, and certainly not in this way. Margaret, who had been standing beside him, looked equally stunned, placing a hand over her mouth. Peter clung to her side, unsure of what he was seeing. John could hardly look at Nayeli directly. She was not an object, nor a thing to be possessed. She was a person, full of history, emotion, and experience. But society, the official reminded him, had rules, and the lottery had been conducted according to those rules. For the next few days, John wrestled with conflicting feelings. There was still some excitement he had indeed won, but it was not the kind he had imagined. Nayeli remained in the house, quiet and observant. She worked carefully, never overstepping boundaries, yet never fully submissive either. John found himself watching her, trying to understand her, and feeling a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. He realized that wealth, as he had imagined it, was not simply coins or goods. This was wealth of a different sort, a lesson in human complexity that he had never anticipated. Neighbors and townspeople began to react. Some were scandalized, whispering that John was now a man of considerable means because he owned Nayeli. Others were curious, watching how the situation would unfold. For John, it was overwhelming. Every day, he confronted questions he had never thought to ask. How should he treat her? What did fairness mean in this context? Should he, treat her with kindness while living within the rules of society? Nayeli's presence became a mirror, reflecting his own values and prejudices back at him. By the end of the first week, John realized that nothing in his life had prepared him for this unexpected fortune. It was more than wealth, more than a prize. It was a test of his character, his compassion, and his understanding of humanity. He had dreamed of comfort and stability, yet he now faced a far more challenging and meaningful opportunity: to recognize another person's humanity, to act with integrity, and to navigate the complicated moral landscape of his time. The days stretched into weeks, and John slowly began to acknowledge the truth. Winning the lottery had changed him in ways he could not have imagined. It was no longer about money. It was about understanding, patience, and learning to see the world through another person's eyes. Nayeli remained quiet, often watching him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. And John could sense her resilience, her dignity, and her careful assessment of him. In a strange way, the lottery had given him a gift far greater than gold, the chance to confront his own humanity. The days after the lottery win were strange and heavy with uncertainty. John Carmichael had expected gold or coins, maybe a chest full of valuables that would make life easier. Instead, he found himself in the position of caretaker for Nayeli, a young woman whose presence seemed to fill the house with an unfamiliar weight. For John, every interaction with her felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't know where to begin. Nayeli was quiet but observant. She moved through the small house with a calm precision, taking care of her chores without complaint. She cooked simple meals, cleaned the rooms, and tended to Peter when he ran around with his endless energy. Yet, beneath the surface of obedience, there was an unmistakable alertness. Her eyes watched John, Margaret, and even Peter with careful attention, as if measuring their intentions. John found himself puzzled. She did not speak much, and when she did, it was measured and deliberate. Her words were few, but each carried meaning. John tried to follow the advice of the town's elders, who whispered words of caution. Treat her as you must, but remember who she belongs to, some said. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was a strange reward indeed, but a valuable one. These comments gnawed at John's conscience. He realized that society's view of Nayeli as a prize or property clashed sharply with what he could see in her. Intelligence, dignity, and an independent spirit. The more he observed her, the more he felt a mixture of guilt and admiration. In the first few weeks, John attempted to establish rules and routines. He assigned Nayeli chores around the house and encouraged her to rest when work was done. At the same time, he tried to make her feel welcome, offering her a modest room and speaking kindly. Yet he felt awkward, unsure of how to interact without seeming controlling or dismissive. Nayeli would often look at him with a steady gaze, and in those moments, John felt both respect and challenge. He realized that she was testing him as much as he was trying to understand her. One afternoon, as the sun cast golden light through the windows, John found himself sitting on a wooden chair, while Nayeli arranged the small garden outside. The garden had been neglected for years, but she had taken to it quickly, planting flowers and herbs with care. John watched her hands work the soil, noticing the skill and patience she displayed. It was then that he felt a stirring of curiosity, not just about her work, but about her story. Tell me, John said hesitantly, where you come from, what your life was like before. Nayeli paused, her hands hovering over the soil. For a moment, the wind seemed to carry the quiet of the open fields, and even Peter stopped playing to listen. She did not answer immediately, choosing her words carefully. When she spoke, it was in slow, deliberate English, the accent of her people coloring each phrase. She spoke of her family, the land she had known, the traditions she had grown up with. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of sadness, the kind that comes from having lost much at a young age. John listened, captivated and humbled. He had never realized how rich and deep her life had been before she came to Willow Creek. This moment of shared stories marked a small turning point. John began to see Nayeli not as a possession, but as a person with her own past, hopes, and fears. It was a difficult realization. He still struggled with the societal norms that defined her place in his household. But he also felt the pull of his conscience and his growing respect for her. He found himself asking questions he had never considered. Could he allow her freedom within his home? How could he honor her humanity without defying the community entirely? Nayeli, for her part, also adjusted slowly to her new reality. She was cautious around John and Margaret, aware that they had power over her life. But she was not passive. She found ways to assert her presence subtly through careful observation, quiet suggestions, and the calm dignity she maintained in her work. She noticed how John would hesitate when speaking to her, how he seemed conflicted between what society demanded and what his heart told him was right. Over time, a silent understanding began to develop between them. John's daily routines started to change. He spent more time in the house, observing Nayeli and thinking about her life. He asked her to teach him small things, how to tend to certain plants, how to cook some traditional dishes she remembered from her home. In these simple moments, John found joy and connection he had never experienced before. The house, once just a place of chores and quiet routines, now felt alive with learning and discovery. Peter, too, began to form a tentative friendship with Nayeli. She would tell him short stories from her homeland, teaching him words in her language and lessons about nature, animals, and courage. The boy was enchanted, and John could see the positive influence Nayeli had on his son. Neighbors continued to talk. Some disapproved, seeing John as either too soft or too bold for treating Nayeli with respect. Others whispered that she might bring unexpected advantages to the household in ways they could not predict. John, however, found that he cared less about gossip and more about doing what he felt was right. He realized that morality, kindness, and understanding were far more valuable than gold or reputation. He was learning that wealth could be measured not in money, but in the depth of human connection and the lessons one learned from compassion. Yet not everything was smooth. There were moments of tension. Nayeli occasionally spoke sharply when she felt misunderstood, and John struggled to balance authority and fairness. They argued about chores, schedules, and expectations. But even in disagreement, there was a growing sense of mutual respect. John found that listening carefully, acknowledging her perspective, and admitting his mistakes helped diffuse tension. Nayeli, in turn, learned to trust that he would consider her feelings and not simply impose his will. The change in John did not go unnoticed. Margaret, who had initially been wary of Nayeli's presence, began to see the young woman in a new light. She observed the care with which John treated her, the patience he showed, and the small but meaningful efforts to learn from her. Margaret's own respect and warmth toward Nayeli grew, creating a household atmosphere that was calmer, more cooperative, and unexpectedly vibrant. Even the small garden began to flourish, symbolic of the growth and change taking place within the family. One evening, as the sun set in a brilliant array of oranges and purples, John sat outside on the porch, watching Nayeli and Peter play in the yard. He reflected on the events of the past month. The lottery, which had seemed like a chance to secure financial security, had instead brought him something far more complex and meaningful. Nayeli had challenged his assumptions, taught him patience, and opened his eyes to a different way of seeing the world. He realized that life was rarely as simple as one imagined. Fortune, it seemed, had a way of teaching lessons in unexpected forms. By the end of the first season, John had grown into his new role not as an owner, but as a guardian and student of human dignity. Nayeli had settled into routines, but she remained independent in spirit, guiding him subtly and teaching him about courage, tradition, and resilience. The household was no longer just a place of survival. It had become a small community of learning, respect, and shared experiences. John began to understand that true wealth might never come in the form of coins or material goods. Instead, it came from understanding, empathy, and the ability to recognize the humanity in others. Nayeli had become both a mirror and a teacher, reflecting the qualities he admired and the ones he still needed to develop. The lottery, in its unexpected way, had given him a gift beyond measure: the chance to grow as a person, to learn humility, and to begin to see the world through the eyes of someone who had lived a life so different from his own. And so, as the days turned into weeks, John Carmichael found himself living a life richer than he had ever imagined. The gift he had been given, a person, not gold, was teaching him the greatest lesson of all. That fortune is not measured in wealth alone, but in the depth of understanding and the bonds formed between people. As the seasons changed, John Carmichael began to understand that living with Nayeli was not just a lesson in responsibility, it was a journey of discovery. Every day brought new challenges and new moments of insight, and he found himself learning as much from her as she did from him. Their relationship, initially built on uncertainty and caution, began to shift toward a fragile but genuine understanding. Nayeli, though quiet, was not passive. She watched John carefully, noticing his reactions, his hesitations, and his attempts to reconcile society's expectations with his own conscience. There were days when she would not speak, instead observing the household, the routines, and even the townspeople who came to buy goods from the shop. Her presence, though calm, was always thoughtful, always measured. She was a careful teacher, guiding John in subtle ways without overtly challenging him. John, in turn, grew more conscious of how he treated her. He remembered the advice of the townsfolk, who saw her as a prize or property. But he increasingly felt that those opinions mattered little compared to what he knew to be true. Nayeli was not an object. She was a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and memories. Treating her with respect and dignity became a priority for him, though he often stumbled, unsure of where the line between authority and fairness lay. One afternoon, John invited Nayeli to help him organize the shop's inventory. It was a task he had always considered tedious, but he thought that by working together, they might find a way to bond further. Nayeli agreed quietly, her movements precise and efficient. As they worked, she began to explain her methods for organizing items, sharing techniques she had observed in her own home before coming to Willow Creek. John listened attentively, fascinated by her practical knowledge and thoughtful approach. It was a simple lesson, but one that gave him insight into her intelligence and resourcefulness. "You have a way of seeing things I never noticed," John said, genuinely impressed. Nayeli paused for a moment before replying, her voice calm. "I pay attention. Every place has its own rhythm. You just have to watch." It was a small exchange, but it carried weight. John realized that Nayeli was not only capable, but wise in ways that he had never considered. Her presence brought balance and order to his household, but it also challenged him to think differently, to question assumptions he had taken for granted. Over time, they began to share small conversations about life, dreams, and memories. Nayeli told stories of her childhood, describing the wide-open plains, the animals she had known, and the community she had grown up in. John shared his own experiences, though he spoke more cautiously, aware that his life had been far different from hers. Peter would sometimes join these conversations, asking innocent questions that led to laughter and gentle lessons. Through these moments, a bond formed, one built not on authority or ownership, but on curiosity, mutual respect, and shared humanity. Yet their growing understanding was not without tension. There were moments when John's pride or societal expectations caused friction. He would occasionally attempt to direct Nayeli's actions in ways that seemed necessary to him, but felt controlling to her. Nayeli would respond with calm but firm resistance, explaining her perspective with quiet clarity. John learned to listen more carefully, to pause before reacting, and to consider her thoughts as equally important as his own. These moments were sometimes uncomfortable, but they were also crucial in building trust between them. One particular evening stands out in John's memory. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, drenching the town in heavy rain and strong winds. The small house creaked and groaned as water seeped through cracks in the roof. John rushed to secure the windows and protect the furniture, but Nayeli calmly took charge of other tasks, moving quickly and efficiently. She instructed Peter to stay safe and guided Margaret in securing the smaller belongings. John watched her work and felt a deep sense of gratitude and admiration. "You handle this better than I ever could," he admitted as the storm raged outside. Nayeli gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Experience teaches you," she said. "You learn how to survive." That night, as the storm subsided and the house settled back into quiet, John reflected on how much he had underestimated her strength. Nayeli had faced challenges he could scarcely imagine, and yet she carried herself with dignity and calm. He realized that true resilience was not about physical strength alone, but about patience, intelligence, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. As weeks turned into months, John began to involve Nayeli in decisions that extended beyond the house. He asked for her advice on shop matters, on how to interact with certain customers, and on small improvements they could make to daily life. Nayeli's insights were thoughtful and practical, and John increasingly recognized the value of her perspective. He began to see her not only as a member of the household but also as a guide in understanding the world more fully. Through these shared responsibilities, a subtle partnership emerged. John's authority remained, as society expected, but Nayeli's influence grew quietly, yet firmly. He learned that leadership was not about commanding others, but about listening, understanding, and valuing the contributions of those around him. Nayeli, in turn, became more open, sharing her knowledge and wisdom while still maintaining the cautious independence that had always defined her. The bond between John and Nayeli deepened further during the spring planting season. The small garden behind the house, once neglected, flourished under her care. She taught John how to tend the soil properly, when to plant seeds, and how to nurture young plants. John discovered that gardening was not merely a chore. It was an opportunity to connect with nature, to practice patience, and to witness growth in both plants and people. As they worked side by side, conversation flowed naturally. They discussed hopes for the future, the importance of community, and the simple joys that often went unnoticed. Peter, too, thrived under Nayeli's guidance. She introduced him to the habits of observation, patience, and care, teaching him how to respect living things and the environment around him. John watched his son grow more attentive and thoughtful, recognizing that Nayeli's influence extended beyond the household. She was shaping not only his own understanding, but also the values of the next generation. Despite these positive changes, challenges persisted. Some townspeople remained critical, gossiping about John's unusual relationship with Nayeli. Others expressed disbelief that he treated her with respect rather than command. John often felt torn between wanting to maintain harmony in the community and following the moral compass that Nayeli had helped him develop. He realized that true courage was not only in facing danger but also in standing firm in one's convictions, even when others disapproved. Through it all, Nayeli remained a steady presence, guiding John with quiet wisdom. She did not demand recognition or reward, but her influence was undeniable. John began to understand that she had transformed his household not through force or words alone, but through example, through patience, intelligence, and unwavering dignity. By the end of the first year, John reflected on how much his life had changed. The lottery, which he had once believed would bring him material wealth, had instead brought him something far more valuable: the opportunity to grow as a person, to learn humility, and to understand another human being in ways he had never imagined. Nayeli had taught him that true wealth was measured not by coins or possessions, but by the depth of understanding, respect, and compassion one shared with others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, John sat on the porch watching Nayeli and Peter work in the garden. The air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers, and the house hummed with quiet activity. John realized that this ordinary life, filled with shared labor, small lessons, and mutual respect, was richer than any fortune he could have won in a lottery. He understood, finally, that the true prize had not been the material reward at all. It had been Nayeli herself, not as property, but as a teacher, a guide, and a living testament to resilience, intelligence, and dignity. She had challenged him, inspired him, and helped him grow in ways he could never have anticipated. And in that moment, John felt a profound gratitude that went beyond words, knowing that his life had been transformed by the unexpected gift of understanding another person's humanity. As the seasons passed and the years quietly stacked upon each other, John Carmichael began to see his life through a different lens. What had started as a bewildering lottery win, something that had seemed like an impossible stroke of fortune, had transformed into something much deeper. The young woman named Nayeli, whom he had once seen as a prize, had become the center of a quiet revolution in his life. Through her, he learned lessons that no amount of wealth could ever have taught him. John's understanding of wealth had changed. He had once thought of wealth as something external: gold, land, coins, property, things that could be counted, measured, and admired. But as the years rolled by, he realized that true wealth could not be measured by numbers or material possessions. It lay in the quiet moments of shared understanding, in the conversations where two people truly listened to each other, in the strength to face challenges with grace, and in the humility to acknowledge one's own limitations. These were the things that had filled his life since Nayeli had come into his home. Over time, the small, humble house where John lived with Margaret, Peter, and Nayeli had become a home in the truest sense. It was not just a place of shelter, but a sanctuary of shared experiences, growing wisdom, and mutual respect. What had once been a household of routine tasks and daily survival had become a place where learning never stopped, where every person contributed and every person was valued. Nayeli's presence had brought something John had never fully understood before: peace. She had an unwavering calmness about her, a quiet dignity that radiated from the way she moved through the world. There was no need for loud words or grand gestures to make her point. She simply lived with honor and integrity, showing John, through her actions, how to approach life with patience and humility. As the years passed, he could feel her influence in every corner of the house, in the way the family interacted, and even in the way they interacted with the townspeople. John's relationship with Margaret had also deepened. At first, Margaret had been uncertain about Nayeli's place in their home. Like John, she had initially seen Nayeli as an unexpected and somewhat awkward presence. But over time, she too had learned to appreciate the young woman's quiet wisdom. Margaret had grown to rely on Nayeli, not just for help with the chores, but for her perspective on life. The three of them, John, Margaret, and Nayeli, had become an unlikely team. Each person brought their own strengths, and together they created a balance that was greater than the sum of its parts. Peter, now a young boy on the edge of adolescence, had been profoundly shaped by Nayeli's influence. He had learned to respect nature, to be patient, and to listen more than he spoke. Though the world outside their home was filled with the noise of progress and the expectations of society, inside, the Carmichael home was a place of understanding, growth, and quiet strength. Peter often found himself wondering about the world beyond the small town, but he knew that what he had learned in his home would guide him no matter where life took him. But even with all the changes within their home, John knew that the world outside still held its opinions. The people of Willow Creek had always been curious about the Carmichaels' unusual household. Some were skeptical, whispering among themselves about how John treated Nayeli as if she were a member of the family rather than a possession. But John had stopped caring about their opinions. He no longer saw Nayeli as a prize to be paraded or judged by others. She was a person, a teacher, and a companion, and in his heart, he knew that their bond was not something to be defined by society's narrow standards. It was in the quiet of one particular evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, that John found himself reflecting on just how far he had come. The day had been simple. The shop had been busy, Margaret had baked bread for dinner, and Peter had been running around with a few of the other children. But John found himself on the porch, watching the sunset, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Nayeli joined him, as she often did in the evenings, sitting beside him on the wooden steps. She did not speak at first, but simply sat quietly, her gaze turned toward the horizon. After a long moment, John spoke, his voice soft. I never would have guessed, you know, that life could be like this. Nayeli turned her head slightly, her expression calm. What do you mean? I mean, I thought wealth was all about what you could hold in your hands, John said, looking down at his calloused palms. I thought it was the things you could see, like coins or land, but I've come to realize it's something much deeper. Nayeli was quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She had always understood this truth, but it seemed to comfort John to express it out loud. She nodded slowly, acknowledging his words. You've taught me that. John continued, his voice tinged with wonder. All these years, I thought I was living a simple life, but I was only looking at it through a narrow lens. It was only when you came into our home that I began to see what really mattered. Nayeli smiled gently. You see, now, John, it's not about what we own, but about what we give. The more we give of ourselves, our time, our kindness, our respect, the richer we become. John felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had never imagined that a simple moment on the porch, sharing a conversation with Nayeli, could fill him with such a profound sense of fulfillment. He realized that everything he had once believed about wealth was wrong. The real treasures in life were the bonds of love, the moments of connection, and the lessons shared between people. Over the next few years, as the town of Willow Creek changed with the times, so did the Carmichael family. John had become a respected man in his community, not because of any financial success, but because he had gained something far more valuable: wisdom. He had learned how to see people not as objects, but as equals. And Nayeli, with her quiet strength and dignity, had taught him this lesson without ever asking for anything in return. The small shop that John had once struggled to make profitable was now thriving. He no longer saw his business as a means to accumulate wealth, but as a way to serve the community. He treated each customer with the same care and respect that he had learned to give to Nayeli, to Margaret, and to Peter. His relationships with the townspeople had shifted. They no longer saw him as just a shopkeeper. They saw him as a man of character, someone who had learned to look beyond appearances and truly understand the people around him. As for Nayeli, she had remained an integral part of the household, not as a servant or a prize, but as a partner and a friend. Over time, John had come to realize that she had not just changed his life, she had shaped his very understanding of what it meant to be human. In the end, it was clear to John that winning the lottery had given him a gift far greater than any amount of money or material goods could ever provide. The lottery had brought Nayeli into his life, and through her, he had discovered the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't about the things he could hold in his hands, but about the relationships he had built, the lessons he had learned, and the love he had shared. His life, which had once seemed ordinary, was now rich with meaning, and for that, he was more grateful than he could ever express. As John sat with Nayeli one last time, watching the sunset in the stillness of the evening, he knew that this was the greatest prize he could ever have hoped for. The real fortune, he realized, had been there all along. It was in the quiet moments, the shared smiles, and the deep understanding between two people who had walked through life together, learning and growing side by side.